From the Delhi studios of Republic TV, it's time for Arnab Goswami on the debate.
Ladies and gentlemen, as the alarming military buildup continues on the Russia-Ukraine border, there is only one question on everyone's mind across the world. Are we staring at a third world war? Can it spiral into that? Who, if anyone, has the controls anymore on what's going to happen on the Ukraine front? Here are the developments as of tonight, and then the global debate.
Russia and Belarus are intensifying their military drill by the day.
Выполнили повторно патрулирование государственной границы Республики Беларусь в составе пары совместно с экипажами Су-30СМ Российской Федерации, в ходе которого были отработаны тактические приемы, а также взаимодействие между экипажами.
Germany is sending its troops and tanks to Lithuania to aid Ukraine.
And within the next few days, I expect around 350 additional soldiers and around 100 additional vehicles. Among them, howitzers, which will reinforce our RT task force.
Lithuania has sent Stinger air defense systems to Ukraine. East Europe has turned into a war zone, with Western countries sending aid for Ukraine, fearing a possible Russian invasion in the former Soviet country over its growing closeness to NATO.
We continue to see signs of Russian escalation, including new forces arriving at the Ukrainian border. As we've said before, we are in the window when an invasion could begin at any time, should Vladimir Putin decide to order it.
Russia, along with its allies, has amassed over 1 lakh troops along with artillery and tanks near the Ukraine border. The last 1 year has seen new Russian units closer to border, thus surrounding Ukraine from 3 sides. Reminiscent of the Cold War era, global powers are sharply divided, with Russia and its traditional allies on one side and the West on the other, plunging the world into another warlike situation.
The signs are, as you've heard from President Biden, that they're at least planning for something that could take place as early as in the next 48 hours. That is extremely concerning, where what we need to do is make sure that President Putin understands the economic consequences, the political consequences of doing this.
Biden-Putin telephonic conversation has failed to make any breakthrough, but diplomatic options are still open. Germany is trying to play the mediator to try and diffuse the tensions.
Для нас така історія, начебто як мрія, такий сигнал, куди ми йдемо, а коли там будемо, ніхто не знає, не тільки Україна, а навіть деякі члени НАТО.
Kremlin too is of the opinion that diplomacy still has a chance.
Все-таки наша такая последовательная, разъяснительная работа и приверженность разъяснению нашей правоты, при готовности выслушать какие-то серьезные встречные аргументы, мне кажется, наши возможности далеко не исчерпаны. Они, конечно, не должны продолжаться бесконечно, но на данном этапе я бы предложил их продолжать и наращивать.
But with no immediate signs of a breakthrough, is the world at the brink of a third world war? Are Biden and Putin nudging the world towards an armed conflict over Ukraine? Let's debate.
From Moscow this evening, I'm joined by Dmitry Babich. He's a political analyst at the INOS SMI Media Project, and Andrei Kortunov is Director General of the Russian International Affairs Council. Ambassador Frank Wisner, former diplomat and International Affairs Advisor at Square Patton Boggs. Ambassador Ian C. Kelly, former spokesperson for the U.S. Department of State. Ruslan Bortnik from Kiev, in that window there is a political analyst from Kiev in Ukraine. And live from Warsaw in Poland, on the Polish side, a lot of arms being put together right now, lot of troops gathering, is Beata Gorka Winter. Thank you all very much for joining us. We are having this discussion at a time when there is a massive build-up in at least 6 countries surrounding Ukraine and Russia. There are British rocket launchers on standby in Estonia. There are Danish fighter jets in Lithuania. There is the UK cavalry squadron in Poland. There are French troops. There's a UK RAF squadron in Romania. Spanish jets deployed in Bulgaria. Spanish warship on standby. UK Type 45 destroyer in the Black Sea. There are thousands of American troops on high alert, and there is a build-up of 100,000 plus troops, tanks, artillery, massive missile regiments on standby in Russia and the Belarus. Now, having gone so far, the question is, Ambassador Wisner, I want to start with you. Is a pullback even conceivable?
First of all, let me tell you how pleased I am to be with you, all your panelists. This is an extraordinarily dangerous and important moment. That said, and while I don't pretend I can read the mind of the president of Russia, I believe there is room for diplomacy. I believe his ambitions are essentially political, to deal with the security construct in Eastern Europe and to deal with Ukraine and Russian relations. Those are the primary objectives. Neither are served by military action. So on a rational basis, I believe the kinds of discussions that are on offer between the West, including NATO, and between Ukraine and the Minsk parties offer promise for a diplomatic way out of the crisis that we're currently facing. And I remain hopeful, but nonetheless, as you correctly point out, nothing is being left to chance. If there's military action, the West will respond, not militarily with an intervention in Ukraine, but politically, economically, and we stand ready to defend our NATO allies and be part of them in defending the alliance.
You're measuring your words very, very carefully. And I think that itself reflects the gravity of the situation here today. My job, I would love a dialogue, and I want to go across to Andrei Kortunov, who's the Director General of the Russian International Affairs Council. He's joining us from Moscow. Mr. Kortunov, Ambassador Frank Wisner, very seasoned voice in American diplomacy, says that Vladimir Putin is responding as a politician. Do you agree with that? And if he is responding as a politician, is he doing this out of an immediate political interest? And further, having said that, if I can have Ambassador Wisner on the other side, please, to my directors. If that is the reason, can he pull back? 70% of your military power is already placed for an invasion of Ukraine. Can you pull back?
That's a question you had best ask the president of Russia. I'm afraid I can't read his mind.
Now, I was putting that question to Andrei Kortunov, who is the Director General of the Russian International Affairs Council, Ambassador Wisner. Let's hear from him. I was getting a response from him on that.
Thank you.
Well, I'm not president of Russia either, so I'm not in a position to talk on behalf of him. But I think that the goal of President Putin was to get the Western attention. And if this was the goal, he clearly reached this goal. We have a chain of high-level foreign visitors to Moscow, so the political dialogue has started. I think that for Russia, another concern is that we might see a breakdown of the Minsk agreements And definitely this is something that Putin would like to prevent. So my take is that Russia will gain very little, but will lose a lot if it is ready to invade Ukraine. And definitely Vladimir Putin is a rational politician. He should do his cost-benefit analysis. So I would suggest that Putin is not going to invade Ukraine. He sent his signal to Kyiv, but also to the West. And he hopes that this signal has been heard, so he would be in a position to discuss potential resolution of the crisis, which means, first and foremost, how to stop the NATO infrastructure moving in the eastward direction.
Okay. I personally think, Mr. Kortunov, and I want to ask that to Dmitry Babich, that Russia will never get, and I want to bring in Ambassador Kelly and Dmitry Babich into the debate, Ambassador Kelly from Illinois and in the US, and Dmitry Babich from Moscow. Mr. Babich, am I correct if I say that Russia will never get a public declaration by NATO that Ukraine will not join the organization? I don't think they will ever get a public declaration from Ukraine that they won't join NATO. So can Putin, the politician, appear to hold back and not follow through? What will happen to his personal image, Mr. Babich, and his ego, his political ego?
Well, first, it will depend on NATO. What will Putin get from it? I hope that NATO will develop in a peaceful direction, that it will behave more rationally. Just before the program, when you enumerated all the troops which are amassing around Ukraine and around Russia, please note that you noted Western troops arriving to various parts of the former Soviet Union. There are Germans in Lithuania, there are English in Estonia, there are Spanish ships in the Black Sea. So how, logically, how can we say that Moscow is aggressive if during the last 30 years Moscow has been retreating? And now on the territory of the country where I was born and where Mr. Kortunov was born and which we consider ours, there are hostile troops in several former Soviet republics. So there is a small contradiction here. And sorry, I have to tell you that, of course, Russia does not have 70% of its military capability next to Ukraine. Even
just losing the line there with Mr. Babich. Let me go across to Ambassador Kelly in the meantime and keep the discussion going here. Ambassador Kelly, what chance does NATO or the Americans truly have? I know there's been a lot of muscle flexing, but this can America or can NATO afford to take on Russia in its own backyard? This is not happening in an outside location. It's just on the Russian borders. Thank you. Yes.
I'm sorry. Can you repeat the last part of your question?
Yeah, I was just asking you whether NATO or the Americans can really take on Russia militarily on the Russian border, in Russia's own backyard.
Well, let me answer that question by pointing out what the goals are of at least of the United States, but I think of all of NATO. I think one is to confirm the right of all countries to choose their own security arrangements, and that is something which has been agreed to by every country in Europe, and also by the Soviet Union, and then by Russia in various OSCE documents. So that's one point. The other point, I think, is that it's very important that we show very seriously with troops on the ground that we intend to live up to our our responsibility, our duty to defend countries that are threatened in the NATO alliance. And I'd also, just to, as a counterpoint to what Mr. Babic said, I'll point out that until 2014, there were no troops on the flanks of Russia. There were no NATO troops on the flanks of Russia. There were some troops that came in and out, but there was no infrastructure. After 2014, the security situation in Eastern Europe changed, and the NATO alliance, no longer felt bound by the assurances we gave back in 1997 that we did not foresee any need to put infrastructure into Eastern Europe. But by Russia's own aggressive actions in Ukraine, that security situation has changed. And so we have sent troops. And I think this is really because of Russia's actions, because of Russia's aggressive actions.
So I mean, can I get a response? Is Mr. Babic back on? Audrey is also hearing this. Would you like to respond to what Ambassador Kelly seems to insinuate, that this has really been brought about by Russian actions?
If it's a question to me, I can try to respond to that. I think that there was a chain of events. And we cannot write the history from the point which we would like. Of course, if we look at the history of Russia-NATO relations, we should recall, for instance, the NATO actions in the former Yugoslavia, which was an important signal to Moscow that NATO is not exactly a defensive alliance. We should probably remember the actions of NATO countries in Libya. Again, this is not something that would qualify as a purely defensive measure. So there is a long history of this relationship, and there are disappointments and frustrations on both sides. But I have to tell you that if we get back to the NATO Founding Act of 1997, both sides more or less abide, even now, they abide by the provisions of this Founding Act. And I hope that they will continue to honor their commitments by the Founding Act. Speaking of the current situation, of course, NATO is in a position to send its troops to whatever member country it wants to. But I don't think that anyone in the West contemplates the idea of a Russian invasion of Lithuania or Estonia or Romania. Therefore, I do not quite understand why the United States needs to send more troops to these East European countries, which are clearly not in danger of a Russian aggression. I think that it might be excessive. But again, I don't think that these deployments are considered as an immediate challenge to Russia's security. Russia is concerned about potential future advancement of the NATO military infrastructure in the eastward direction. And this is something that, in my view, can and should be negotiated, like it was, for example, in the case of the 2+4 agreements on the German reunification, when it was agreed that East Germany would become a part of the United Germany and a part of NATO, but that no foreign troops, no nuclear weapons will be stationed in East Germany, and it will not be a place for NATO training exercises. I think that is an example how you can manage the problem without creating problems, additional problems to any of participating states. And maybe this is something that we should look back to.
I'd also like to bring in Ruslan Bortnik and Ms. Winter from Warsaw. And I'm joined by Fred Ware as well. And Fred is a senior journalist from Moscow. Ruslan, as a political analyst, can NATO really respond or help Ukraine if there is a full-scale crisis of a military conflict, if it were to break out? Can it really help Ukraine or even help itself?
Of course, we have very dangerous situation around of Ukraine because heavy concentration of foreign troops around Ukrainian borders, troops from both of sides, makes situation is very explosive, because in this situation every mistake or every provocation will lead to conflict, will lead to serious problem. Too many weapons, too many soldiers around of Ukraine, and too many very heavily diplomatic dialogue around of Ukraine. Talking about, but at the same time, Ukrainian government and bigger part of Ukrainian experts don't believe in Russian intervention in Ukraine, because we don't see enough forces, enough power nowadays from the Russian side to make a deep aggression, deep intervention inside of Ukraine. Talking about NATO, of course we are not agreed, and we don't like such way in which NATO helps for Ukraine nowadays. From the one side, of course, NATO gives a lot of weapons, ammunition, and different type of resources. But at the second, from the another side, NATO countries clearly said that they are not ready to fight for Ukraine. They are not ready to send their soldiers to Ukraine to defend the Ukraine. And in the last question and last thesis, I want to say, at the same time, we have no intervention, Russian intervention, deep intervention nowadays, but we have very deep and very heavy informational intervention on Ukraine. This informational panic around of Ukraine will lead us for losing a lot of money. We lost more than $20 billion for last month. This money was evacuated from Ukraine by investors and different businessmen. And this is a big problem, because this wave of panic which was broadcasted by Western media made a real ill and a real defeat for nowadays Ukrainian economy.
I agree. See, I agree with you what you're saying out there, because Ruslan, you know, NATO cannot help. I mean, this is our own view here. NATO cannot help Ukrainians. NATO is a failed alliance globally. NATO failed in Afghanistan. What will they do now? I mean, they had tens of thousands of soldiers in Afghanistan for 2 decades. And even when Crimea was annexed, and I'm sure, Ms. Winter, you'll agree with me, NATO says it is uncompromising on alliances, but when Crimea was annexed, the NATO Secretary General said, no, we can't do anything. We are a defensive alliance. We do not seek confrontation. That's what they did then. They didn't confront Russia. So I don't know to what extent NATO can be taken seriously on this.
Yes, you're right. And many Ukrainians look at NATO for nowadays like not partner, like an organization which is going near the Ukraine, which a neighbor, but not partner. NATO, of course, the topic of NATO is
NATO is also, and I'd like to go to Ms. Winter. Can you hear me in Warsaw? Ms. Winter, NATO is also divided. You know, it's divided. Germany refused to send weapons to Ukraine. It blocked Estonia from supplying old German howitzers to Kiev. So NATO is itself divided. So I don't know how a divided group can take on Russian military might should Putin decide to attack.
Well, am I heard?
Yeah, please.
Correct. Okay, so
Yes,
NATO
you are.
is not so much NATO is not so much divided as we tend to see it. Of course, there are minor discrepancies and minor differences between the stance of different allies. But if you look at the political stance of NATO, it's quite clear, and we sent this message to Russia many times. And Secretary General Jens Stoltenberg also was pointing that NATO is against any possible aggression. So in political terms, NATO is very correct to say that Russia now is posing a threat. And if we want to negotiate, we cannot do it under such huge military pressure that because if you start negotiations deploying military troops in such an amount, these are not negotiations, it's kind of dictate. And we feel that Putin, because it's especially about Putin, of course, and his elite, that Putin wants to dictate the West in what direction the West should enlarge, in what direction, what kind of foreign and security policy NATO countries should wage, and also countries like Ukraine, which is not part of NATO, but I would like to underline here that according to international law, UN security, UN chart, and many other international arrangements which we agreed on after the Second World War, every country has its right to define his foreign and security policy. So if Ukraine shapes his foreign policy in a way that the society, the government wants to join NATO, and also other countries like Georgia, Russia cannot just impose its own solution. We even have this quite French declaration in Sweden. Russian ambassador lately told that Sweden should not join NATO, and really, is it in capacity of Russian government to impose what kind of foreign security policy countries should wage? That's unbelievable from our point of view. There are no spheres of influence anymore, and it was said here that NATO is approaching Russia, which is actually not true, because if you see look at the map and you see how along the border of NATO with Russia is, we can see that you cannot speak about encirclement. And this is your main argument here in this debate. So NATO is not encircling Russia. That's one look at the map was clarified as unjustified statement.
Okay, but eventually, eventually, Ms. Winter, Ms. Winter, I want to bring into your first point and get a response from Fred in Moscow. Fred, you just heard from Ms. Bita Gorka-Winter, who's an international security and defense expert. She's live from Warsaw in Poland. Her basic point was that Russia must stop blackmailing the world and blackmailing NATO. She says if there has to be a discussion, it cannot happen with a massive military presence of the kind that Russia has amalgamated on the Ukrainian border. And she says that is not the right atmosphere to even think about having some talks. So I'd like your response, and then I'll get Charles Kupchan from who's joining us from Georgetown University in Washington. Fred.
Well, I can tell you what the Russians say. They say they have been asking for these kind of talks for 25 years. They have objected strenuously to NATO expansion up to their borders. And if you look at a map, you can see that has in fact happened. Every single former Warsaw Pact country and 3 former Soviet republics have joined NATO. And in 2007 at the Munich Security Conference, Putin laid out all these positions pretty clearly. You can go back and read the transcript of that, and he's not even saying anything new today. What he said to a foreign ministry conference, I think in November, was they just don't listen to us unless they feel tense. So we'll make them feel tense. I do believe, and I'm not advocating this, these are scary times. I'm losing sleep along with everybody else. But I do believe that these Russian buildups are theatrical. They're being done in plain sight of satellite cameras with the purpose of getting that conversation going. And Foreign Minister Lavrov said just today that the diplomatic process is far from exhausted. That's quite hopeful. There may be many ways out of this with a little bit of compromise. Nobody's going to give up their principles. But President Zelensky in Kiev said, well, maybe NATO membership is just a dream for Ukraine. So there's some inching, I think, toward what would be an obvious solution, a belt of neutral countries between Russia and NATO. Neutral countries with their doors and windows open to both East and West. Ukraine was that kind of country for a long time. You know, I was down there in Kharkiv a couple of years ago and saw that the Ukrainians are building a giant wall along the border with barbed wire and minefields. And most Ukrainians hate that.
But
they want things to go back the way they were.
Fred, you said, Fred, and I want to intervene here. You
Please.
said, and your choice of words is very interesting. On that, I want to get one more view from Moscow, if I may. And I'm joined by Professor Dr. Vladimir. Professor Vladimir Pryakin,
yes,
who's chair of regional studies and foreign policy, envoy extraordinary and minister, member of RISA, member of BISA, he's live from Moscow. Professor Vladimir, just before you, I was speaking to Frank Ware. I'm trying to get a sense for viewers across on whether the Russian military threat is real. Fred Ware, who's joining us from Moscow, said that he feels it is theatrical. In other words, he says this is drama by the Russians. They are not actually going to carry out any military attack. They are doing it just to scare the Americans.
My dear friend and my dear colleague, I can say to you that if you were in Moscow, you could feel very well that there is no threat to Ukraine from Moscow, from Russia, from Russian people, from Russian nation. It's excluded that Russia could present any danger for Ukraine, for Ukrainian independence, sovereignty, and territorial integrity. Yes, that is sure. And as I said already last time to you, the figure of trade volume between Russia and Ukraine is even bigger than between Russia and such a huge power as India, more than $12 billion, and it was augmented, increased the last year by 28-30%. So there is no intention from Russia to attack Ukraine. And as having a lot of personal links in Ukraine, I can say that neither ordinary Ukrainians wait for any attack of the side of Russia. But you see, there are some politicians in the world which would very like to see Russians and Ukrainians to be in quarrel and to kill each other. You see, and that's why they provoke the tension between two countries and sending a lot of military materials, hardware like Javelin, cartouche, tanks and any other equipment, and giving military technical assistance to the Ukrainian soldiers and officers. But the soldiers and officers themselves in Ukraine are not very much enthusiastic about some kind of attacking their fellows in eastern part of the country, because you see, their logic is quite understandable and easy. Why should I kill my brothers in the east of Ukraine for them willing to use their native Russian language? It's logical.
No, but then why? No, but if you are absolutely 1 minute. Can I get a view from Charles Kupchan? You clearly are blaming someone else. Mr. Charles Kupchan, can you hear that from Professor Vladimir, very senior voice from Moscow? He says we have absolutely no intentions. It's others who want to create some trouble.
I hope, I pray that the two voices that we just heard from Moscow are accurate. I'm skeptical. You've got 130,000 Russian troops on the border, the north, the east. You've got warships in the Black Sea threatening Ukraine from the south. I fear that we're going to see a Russian attack against Ukraine sometime in the not too distant future. Why else would Russia have so much capability on the border with Ukraine? There are two issues that I think leave me cautiously hopeful that that war could be avoided. One is that the conversations are continuing. Diplomacy is occurring on a daily basis. I think that NATO is right to stand by the principle that its doors are open and that countries should be able to chart their own course. Neither Russia nor any other country should be able to bully and coerce its neighbors. On the other hand, I think we all know that NATO is not about to open its doors to Ukraine. It's not going to happen now. It's not going to happen anytime soon. That may create an opening for diplomacy. The other issue here is that what would Russia get out of attacking Ukraine, right? It could take a small operation in the east, annex Donbass, connect Donbass to Crimea, grab a little bit more territory. But that doesn't get Russia what it wants. It wants to topple the government. It wants a Ukraine that comes back into the Russian fold. That is a huge order. I don't think it's possible. I think what will happen is that Russia will alienate the Ukrainian population if it attacks. So for those two reasons, diplomacy still is continuing. I don't see a military operation that Russia can conceivably take on. Let's keep in mind, Putin is a tough customer. He has sent forces into Georgia, Nagorno-Karabakh, Ukraine, Syria. But these have all been relatively limited operations, low risk, low cost. Invading Ukraine, high risk, high cost. And that's why I think it's possible that we will get out of this crisis without a Russian invasion.
So Professor Vladimir, has Putin put himself in a catch-22 situation?
Hello. I would like to tell a little bit to my colleague, Charles.
Yes.
Give me the floor, please.
Yes. You have the floor. Go on, Professor. Please go on. We can hear you loud and clear, Professor Vladimir. We want your reply, in fact, to Charles.
Yes, of course. Thank you a lot. I listened very attentively to what my colleague Charles said in his 3-point NATO, Russian military troops in the west of our country, and some other points. Let me say that I know what is happening there because I am here and I know that, for example, the city of Klimovsk, or where the Russian troops are in the south of Russia, is 300 kilometers from Kiev. And that is a big trouble for our Western colleagues. But nobody says that American tanks are in 200 kilometers distance from St. Petersburg in Estonia. And that is real trouble for us and real alert for Russian audience, because the NATO said officially that it is hostile to Russia. And this hostile organization has its tanks in the suburbia of St. Petersburg. Why it is not a threat for us? Why it is not a drama for us? Why it is not a tragedy for us? And Russian tanks, they are not abroad, but in their territory and rather far from Kiev. And that is a reason for being troubled of our Western colleagues. I cannot understand it. They don't say it, and that is real threat. They are accustomed to a very weak Russia, which it was for 20 years after the dismantling of the Soviet Union. But now Russia is strong enough to defend its national interest. And in the West, they should understand it, that Russia is not a Paraguay. It's a big country who can defend itself and has no aggressive intentions, neither with regard to the fraternal Ukraine, because Ukraine is fraternal country for us and not for America or Great Britain or France for any other country in the West. And the second, as to the NATO, I suppose that what Charles said, it is a very great success of our diplomacy that Charles says that in the distant future, there is no word about the Ukraine adoption joining the NATO, because once ago or 2 months ago, it was in the agenda, this issue, and that is completely unacceptable for Russia, because as I said before, Russia officially declared itself being the hostile to Russia. And joining Ukraine to the NATO could mean the location in Ukraine territory, the military units of NATO countries. It means that missiles can be located in Russia, for example, in the city of Kharkiv, with 5 minutes time achieving Moscow. That is real threat, and not Russian military units in Klimovsk, in 300 kilometers distance from Kiev. That is reality, and not the Russian threat to Ukraine. And of course, it's a great success of Russian diplomacy that the NATO seems to giving up the idea of accepting Ukraine into the NATO. But it's quite logical and understandable, because for adopting Ukraine into the NATO, one should have consensus in the NATO among 30 state members of the NATO. And how could a Portuguese or Dutch or Scotch or any other citizen of NATO to agree with a complete and direct close military threat, which is created by joining the
Professor, I must get a response from our friends in America to what you've said. Ambassador Frank Wisner has patiently been listening in. Charles Kupchan clearly provoked you. The sum total, Ambassador Wisner, what is being said by Professor Vladimir, who's a very senior voice from Moscow, is America and NATO better understand this is a rising Russia. After 20 years, this is a Russia which is not going to take your attempts to question its sovereignty. It is able and ready to flex its military muscles, and it means business. That's sum total of what he's saying. Would you like to respond, Ambassador Wisner, to what Professor Vladimir said from Moscow?
I'm perfectly prepared to admit that Russia is a great power, that Russia's sovereignty and territorial integrity are important issues for Russia. At the same time, I'd expect our Russian friends to appreciate when they take action and intervene militarily in Georgia, and later in Crimea, and then in eastern Ukraine, in the Donbass area, that they have signaled a military intention to change the political circumstances in the rest of Europe and represent as a result a danger signal to our alliance. If Russia is prepared to understand that military threats provoke a response, then we finally get the order right. There would be no buildup of NATO infrastructure and NATO activity in Eastern Europe today were it not for prior Russian actions. So the question is not to today sit back and say whether Russia is a great nation and deserves respect. Of course it does. But the way has to now be found for us on both sides, NATO, the United States, Russia on the other side, to see if we can address the two core problems. What is the security architecture of Europe that will satisfy Russia's needs? And what are the political and internal arrangements inside of Ukraine that will provide a degree of security for the populations of the Donbass? These are legitimate questions, but at the same time, Russia's got to face the fact that menacing military activity has provoked this present crisis, not the other way around.
I want Professor Vladimir and maybe Fred to respond to Alexander Krebet, who's joining us, very senior journalist from Kiev. Sorry to keep you waiting. I'm coming to you, Alexander, in a minute. Now, Professor Vladimir, look at the words Ambassador Frank Wisner uses. He says, you, as in Russia, have signaled your military intention to force your power over Europe. It's all right if you are ambitious as a country, but are you forcing your military might on Europe and therefore putting NATO and American interests at risk?
And I might also add, if I could, why,
yes,
if Ukraine is a fraternal
Charles also wants to add to that. The debate's getting heated. Yes, Charles,
just
briefly.
If you mentioned that Ukraine is a fraternal friend, a brother of Russia. If that's the case, why did Russia invade and illegally annex Crimea and send its forces into Donbass to foster a separatist uprising? That doesn't sound very fraternal to me. And that's part of the reason that those of us watching from Washington are saying Russia may well use force because that's what it's done in the past.
Now, can I interject something here? Since we're getting a bit heated. It seems to me.
Okay, Fred wants to come in. Fred, you're allowed. Fred is responding. Yes, Fred Wire.
Yes,
Fred, please.
I try to see this from both sides, and I do recognize the talk of sovereignty. Countries have the right to make their own associations. These are critical things, and maybe in the 21st century there shouldn't be spheres of influence. But I just wonder if, and I don't think this is hypothetical down the road, the world is changing fast and we're setting precedents now. What if Nicaragua or Venezuela wanted to join a Chinese military alliance? Would the discourse in Washington be all about how, well, those are sovereign countries, they have the right to make their own associations, no third party should have any say in it? Do you think, Charles, that would be the discourse in Washington?
I think it's a valid
Great point,
question.
Fred.
I think it's a valid question, and it's one of the reasons that I personally have had some hesitation about the enlargement of NATO, right? Going back to the 1990s when I worked in the Clinton administration, I understand why Russia could be uncomfortable with Ukrainian membership in NATO. That having been said, U.S., its NATO allies have been very careful not to put high-end weaponry in Ukraine. On NATO's eastern flank, there is a minimal presence of NATO troops, a few thousand in the Baltics, around 4,000, 5,000 U.S. troops in Poland. This is not a threat to Russia. So it seems to me that what the Russians are doing is inflating a threat from Ukraine. And I agree with Frank Wisner, my colleague in New York, that this is a moment when we should sit down and have a discussion about not just Ukraine, but a broader conversation about a security order in Europe in which Russia feels that its voice is heard and in which Russia is a stakeholder.
Alexander, to keep the global peace, will the Ukrainians pull back any plan to join NATO? Because that becomes critical now. What about Ukraine's own position, or does it matter anymore? Alexander.
Thank you for inviting me. No, Ukraine will not to give up its struggle to join NATO because we made it into our constitution, like the Euro-Atlantic core, meaning toward NATO and towards the European Union. But what I haven't heard all of the counterparts and all of the colleagues who are on your program, which is not for the Russia and for the Mr. Putin personally, and for the Kremlin man, Ukraine joining NATO is not a threat at all, because they pretty clearly understand and pretty known well that NATO and will not take Ukraine in within next at least 10 years, because all of the NATO member state leaders, including Olaf Scholz today in Kiev, said that NATO membership of Ukraine is not on the table so far and wouldn't be on the table in the further years. But what is a threat to the Putin, to the Kremlin, is the Ukrainian democracy and Ukrainian freedom. That is what is the real issue for the Putin, because the Russians are watching, Russian people are watching closely for the Ukraine and for its freedoms, its joyful life. It's for freedom of the movement within the European Union. People are more happy, more easygoing, and the Russians are getting poorer and poorer. As far as we know, at least 25% of the Russians are living under the poverty level. Under the poverty level. So, and it's going to shake could shake Putin's throne in the Kremlin, and that's why they are trying, the Russian authorities trying to push more and being more oppressive regime, as far as we see and watch, all of us, since few years at least. They are becoming more and more and more oppressive. Maybe you heard that they put the teenager into jail for playing the computer game. That's insane.
I want to ask Ms. Winter that, frankly, there seems to be no resolution, and this doesn't appear to be theatrics to me. I mean, the way we just got the breaking news that Putin has called all his ambassadors to the Kremlin. So there's something happening. Now, is this also part of the theater? Ms. Winter, is this also theatrical? Calling all, okay, I think we lost the line there. What do you think? Yeah, okay, yeah, you got that. Yeah.
Well, I think, I think we still have a solution here. First of all, Russia should stop threatening us militarily, because this blackmail is really doing nothing good to the mood and to general diplomatic atmosphere. That's the first thing. So releasing military pressure, I would say that's the first point. The second point is that I was listening very carefully to my Russian colleagues here during this debate, and what I would like to say to you is that times really changed, and we have young generations coming into life, coming into political scene, and as politicians, and we have young people coming to different professions. And the only thing you need to understand is that we want to live in a completely different world with the outsider's sphere of influence bubble. It's no longer the case. Young people are not thinking in these terms that there is a sphere of influence of Russia. This Cold War thinking is still dominant, but it is in your generation. If you ask younger generation what they want, they want to live in peace, in stability, and economic prosperity. And as my Ukrainian colleague said,
absolutely. Ms. Winter, I agree with you. The way we look at it, you know, the way I look at it, outside of those who are interested parties, is that the world has just come out of the COVID downturn of a couple of years. The last thing we really need is global conflict, but maybe somewhere for the Americans also to slowly introspect on why it is not a unipolar world anymore. And therefore Putin's aggression, what they consider aggression, may simply be flexing the muscles in his own immediate neighborhood, which is why the question from Fred was very relevant. If Nicaragua were to strongly ally with the Chinese, how would the Americans respond? Food for thought. Ladies and gentlemen, it's been a great debate. Thank you so much. And towards the end, KB says, a couple of responses on the first debate of Pak meddler, says 3 cheers to Waris Pathan for giving a fitting retort to Yaqub and Pakistan. Ria Mirchandani says, been enjoying your global coverage. Please promise us Republic Global. Absolutely, we will. You'll see the scale of coverage on Ukraine as well. And Ishika Sen says, global leaders should refrain from making any provocative statements that can escalate into any type of armed conflict. We've not seen that yet, Ishika, though. Well, thank you for your feedback. And ladies and gentlemen, the best global coverage on what's happening in Ukraine from the ground. Moscow, Kiev, the US, everywhere. Covered here on Republic. See you tomorrow at 9. Good night and goodbye.